Hello and welcome to Scream Scene, the horror movie podcast where we watch every horror movie ever made in chronological order and then we rank them from best to worst, except for our monthly bonus episodes where we cover a horror adjacent movie. My name is Sarah.
And I'm Ben.
Thank you so much for listening today. Ben, how are you doing?
Pretty good. It's been
1 week since you looked at me.
A pretty full day. We visited with family this morning and then had a busy afternoon preparing for this episode. Because this episode was like a lot in a way that some of our more recent episodes have not been.
Mm-hmm. That's about how my day's been. Yeah, so nothing to add.
Right.
No notes.
Fair enough.
What are we watching?
Well, Sarah, today we're watching a movie that's kind of like, in my mind, one of the poster children for the horror adjacent concept.
Absolutely.
Like Abbott and Costello and this movie are kind of the ones I would think of. Mostly because this movie is constantly, frequently, often cited as a horror movie, which it is not. And it often gets on clickbaity internet lists of old movies that are still creepy as fuck or whatever. And you can take GIFs from this movie and stills from this movie and pictures, and it looks pretty creepy. And also the movie has a great deal of fame sort of outside itself, but all of that stuff tells on itself so much in terms of oh, you haven't seen this movie. Mm-hmm. You've not watched this movie, because this is not a horror movie, but it is part of a wider tradition that we have talked about and covered way back at the start of the show. So this is sort of the sequel to our Phantom of the Opera episode. Mm-hmm. This is 1928's The Man Who Laughs, directed by Paul Leni.
This film was picked by our patrons over at patreon.com/screamscenepodcast. We do these bonus episodes because we've hit that goal level on Patreon. So if you know someone who is a patron of the night, give them a high five or a thumbs up emoticon, because we do this because of them. So thank you, everyone who is a patron. Thank you, everyone who voted on the poll to choose this movie. It was a very clear winner that it was The Man Who Laughs.
Yeah.
Which is very funny to me because there was another Paul Leni movie, 1924's Waxworks.
Yeah, which we'll talk a little bit about today.
Okay.
But I'm not surprised that Man Who Laughs won the poll because, as I said,
I think it's listed on the Patreon goal
as
blurb.
the example.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, Sarah, have you ever seen this movie?
I have not. I've seen the many stills and GIFs. My first introduction to knowing about the existence of this movie was meeting you.
That makes sense.
Because I think you were on a forum and your name was the name of this main character, Gwynplaine, and or your user icon was Gwynplaine, played by Conrad Veidt.
Yeah, when I was younger, late teens, early 20s, either I would use Gwynplaine as a internet avatar, or there's also a picture of Conrad Veidt that I would use as an avatar on forums a lot. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I knew well of this movie, but I came to know about this movie because of the most well-known piece of trivia about this movie, which we can talk about later. And that well-known piece of trivia is sort of how I was introduced to this movie, which I think is also how most people find out that this movie exists. But I first saw this movie probably in my teens when I rented it from, the local video rental place on DVD. It would have had to have been after I turned 13. So yeah, I had seen this movie. It's been a while since I have seen it all the way through. We don't own it.
Really? I just assumed we did.
Yeah, it's kind of a surprise, right?
Yeah. Well, because also, as you talked about in the last horror adjacent movie, when we were talking about M, you are a big silent film buff, in addition to just being a film buff, as demonstrated by this podcast, but you're also really big into German silent film.
Yes.
And while this is an American movie, Paul Leni comes from Germany.
Yes, as does Conrad Veidt. There's a lot of Germanic connections here. And yeah, this is one of those like key silent movies that you still hear a lot about. But yeah, I just never was able to track down a copy of this to like own. The first time I saw this, I had a very interesting experience because of the fact that this movie gets presented as if it's a horror movie by like websites and like advertising and like all kinds of things. Like it's just commonly presented as a horror movie in that same way that like a lot of German expressionist films just get automatically presented as horror movies, even if they're not. So, you know, knowing the trivia point about this movie that I did, and that being my introduction and thinking it was going to be a horror movie, I went into the movie with like one expectation and got a very different movie than I thought I was going to get. And because of that, like the first time I saw this, I don't think my take on it was very positive because of that.
That's fair.
Yeah. So it took me a while to like warm up to this movie, and I'm really excited to go back and watch it today with you. To kind of begin the story of this movie, we kind of have to rewind time quite a bit, all the way back to like the early days of the show, and start with another film that we haven't covered that is also a horror adjacent film that was actually one of the other options on the poll this month, which is The Hunchback of Notre Dame. So in 1923, Lon Chaney had starred as Quasimodo in Universal Pictures' adaptation of Victor Hugo's novel, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. The story was reframed largely as a tragic love story, and Hunchback was the first of Universal's super jewels. So back in those days, as longtime listeners will remember, Universal would like categorize their films based on like budget and prestige. And they would have these categories like on the posters. A small number of the films released every year were jewels, which were like A pictures with big stars and big budgets. But most of Universal's releases were Blue Ribbon and Red Feather releases, medium to low budget movies. Hunchback was a super jewel, which Universal would then produce one of a year, starting with Hunchback. And it was produced at a then staggering cost of $1.25 million of the studio's own money, as was owner Carl Laemmle's policy at the time, was for Universal not to borrow money. That film was directed by Wallace Worsley and was largely designed as a showcase for Lon Chaney Sr., as both an actor and a master of makeup. Chaney was famous as the Man of 1,000 Faces, and the key thing to remember about that is that in the early days of film, actors were expected to do their own makeup because that was how things had worked in theater. It just so happened that Chaney was a genius at it, and so his makeup could be a lot more than just like a fake mustache and some eyeshadow. And he would totally transform himself. So he had this extremely elaborate makeup as Quasimodo. And that's one of the reasons why The Hunchback of Notre Dame is sort of remembered as like a silent movie monster, because of Chaney's extremely elaborate and probably somewhat painful makeup in the role. Chaney was something of a masochist, in my opinion. Anyways, this gamble paid off because Hunchback of Notre Dame was a huge hit, grossing $3.5 million. Universal immediately wanted a follow-up project, one that would hopefully copy as much of Hunchback's formula as possible. So that would be a period setting, a literary adaptation from a French author with Gothic elements, and a disfigured lead character for Lon Chaney to play in a tragic love triangle with a beautiful woman and like some normal guy, probably played by Norman Carey. The first pick for the follow-up from both Chaney and Carl Laemmle was Gaston Leroux's novel Phantom of the Opera. But executives at Universal were sort of unsure about whether Phantom could be made into like a satisfying movie. There was a lot of like questions and concerns about its structure as a story, about its weak ending, all kinds of concerns about like, is this a novel that can be turned into a movie properly? People just didn't get it. And because of those concerns, Lemley started looking for like an alternate if Phantom didn't turn out. And that was Victor Hugo's novel, The Man Who Laughs, because, well, it had all of those requisite elements I just mentioned, plus also being the same author as Hunchback of Notre Dame. So Victor Hugo, kind of a big deal?
Just a little bit. A little bit. About as big of a deal as Notre Dame itself.
Right.
You know? Hugo was born on February 26, 1802, and was the youngest of 3 boys. His father, Joseph, was in the Napoleonic Army, and so they would move across France to wherever his next post was, while his mother, Sophie, was a devout Catholic who also remained supportive of the aristocracy.
Well, that's a little dangerous.
Yes.
The aristocracy part, not the Catholicism part. Well, depending on exactly what month it is in the Revolution, the Catholicism part might have been in or out of fashion, but it's Napoleonic times, so.
Yeah. Now, Sophie was getting tired of moving around France, so she ended up separating from Victor's father when Victor was about 1 year old, and so they started living in Paris. His parents would go back and forth, being separated, being not, having their own affairs. And when his father went to Spain in 1808, Victor, at 6 years old, moved with his family to Paris. Living nearby was his mother's boyfriend, Victor Fanot de la Horie, who was a general in the Napoleonic Army, and he became kind of like a mentor to Victor and his brothers. De la Horie would later be arrested and executed for conspiring against Napoleon, so you can kind of see what he and Sophie bonded over.
Sure.
And that happened in 1812, and that was kind of a tumultuous time for Victor because...
And a lot of the rest of the world. Bad year.
I'm hyper-focusing here, though, because, you know, his mentor is rounded up and executed. He and his brothers are sent to live in a boarding school, and Sophie completely separates from their father, and she's like, I'm done. While attending the boarding school, Lycée Louis le Grand, the Louis the Grand school, Victor found his passion for writing, and indeed his inability to not be writing.
That explains his lack of brevity.
Absolutely. And he was greatly inspired by a French literary figure named François René, the Vicomte de Chateaubriand, who is a romantic writer and historian, as well as a politician, a very big guy in French literary circles. And Victor was so inspired. When he was 14, he declared in his diary, I will be Chateaubriand or nothing. So the following year, when Victor's 15, he submitted his first poem to the French Academy. The French Academy is like an organization that prioritizes like French culture, regulates the French language, that sort of thing. And they gave him an honorable mention for this poem, and they refused to believe he was only 15. After his mother died in 1821, Victor married his childhood sweetheart, Adèle Fischer, and devoted himself to writing full-time. So his very first novel came out in 1823. He would have been 21 years old, and it is titled Han de Lund, Han from Iceland.
Okay.
His second novel is 3 years later, titled Rug Jargol, which is a person's name. And the biggest splash of his early works came in 1829 with his story Le Dernier Jour d'un Condamné, The Last Day of a Condemned Man, which is a fictional story, but is often tied to his experience of his mentor being taken and executed, because it's very strongly in favor of abolishing the death penalty.
Gotta wait till 1977 for that, Hugo.
You can't wait that long, Ben. So he's already making big splashes here and he solidified his place among the French Romantic movement with his plays Cromwell in 1827 and Hernani in 1830. So his next notable work, and also key with Romanticism, is 1831's Notre Dame de Paris. He was only 29 years old.
Wow. I've always thought that Notre Dame de Paris was like the work of like an older man because it's so grumpy.
He definitely wrote it as like, wanting to talk about the plight of the poor. But a big motivating factor was wanting to be like, guys, we have this huge building that is beautiful. Let's fucking take care of it.
Mm-hmm.
After Notre Dame, he began planning for his novel Les Miserables, but he would not publish it until like 30 years later.
Oh, wow.
During this period of time, after Notre Dame, he did publish a little bit here and there, but he really focused on expanding his socially conscious mind to politics. This kind of started when he himself was elected to the French Academy in 1841, and that became a huge credibility boost to his public image as a man of France. And he used that to kind of build up into being elected into the National Assembly of the Second Republic in 1848. He would be 46 years old, and really starting his career in politics. Now, when he starts his career in politics, his writing focuses more on nonfiction, writing pamphlets, speeches, that sort of thing. So a lot of his creative outlet came through drawing illustrations, and his illustrations are absolutely beautiful, incredibly detailed. I guess he would only show it to family and friends because he didn't want his illustrations to take any focus away from his writings.
Okay.
But he very well could have been an artist instead of a writer.
Don't look at these. They're too good. Think of me as a writer.
They really are too good. It's ridiculous. Like, you're too talented, guy. When he was elected, he was part of the Conservative Party. The following year, he had a speech calling for the end to misery and poverty, which meant having to break with his Conservative Party membership. During these few years in politics, he also advocated for universal suffrage, free education for children, and of course the abolishment of the death penalty. In 1851, Napoleon III seized power, and Victor criticized this. He saw this as like a dictator coming to power, so he was like very vocal about being critical of this and had a self-imposed exile until 1870.
Where did he live in that period?
So he would eventually settle in, I believe, either Sweden or Switzerland. I forget.
Oh, sure.
But he would travel along to many different like places. Like he went to the Canary Islands, for example, with his family. Yeah. As an example of one of the pamphlets Hugo published about Napoleon the year after he came to power, this pamphlet is titled Napoleon le Petit. So during exile, he continued writing critiques of Napoleon, as well as getting back into writing fiction. And he brought in his calls for social reform into his fiction more explicitly. In 1862, he would publish Les Miserables. And then in 1869, he would publish L'Homme qui rit, which is The Man Who Laughs.
So he wrote this novel like a year or two after Les Miserables?
7.
Okay. I guess I always thought that like, just like the movie, that like this novel would have been like a follow-up to Notre Dame de Paris because it's like got so many like similar elements. But I do sometimes forget that like Hugo's novel doesn't really care about like Quasimodo and the love story. Like it's really just about the building. And as you've pointed out, like all the socially conscious stuff from the adaptations is more like later Hugo, Les Miserables Hugo.
Exactly. He would write many other plays, short stories, whatever, but those are the two big things and the two novels he did during this time. So Napoleon III said in like the 1850s, people can come back. They don't need to be exiled from France. They can come back. Victor said no and would come back in 1870 when Napoleon would no longer be around. And he made it back to Paris just in time for the Paris Commune.
Right. Yeah.
Which we talked about in our Phantom of the Opera episode, which if you want to hear more about, it's episode 14. But in short, it was like a coup, basically a revolutionary government. Victor was like, listen, both sides are being real dicks and like causing a lot of harm to people. But I do support the National Assembly. Once the Paris Commune kind of settled down, the National Assembly is back. He did run for office again in 1872, though he was not re-elected. However, despite that, he continued to be politically involved and active, either as an orator, speaking to the National Assembly, as well as in his own writing. He was very much a believer in like the humanistic progress of mankind. Now, as much as his calls for social reform were pushing boundaries of his like society, he was in line with his contemporaries about believing that colonialism was good and would be bringing civilization into native and indigenous populations.
Right, because like if at the time you were a firm believer in the idea of like the forward progress of mankind, what that would contextually mean in the 19th century was a belief that like history moves forward towards modernism and progressivism, and therefore anything that moves a society in that direction is good, ergo colonialism good. Okay.
He was ardently anti-slavery, even going so far to like write to the United States to be like, you know, you say you're for liberty, but you have slaves. You cannot stand for liberty and also enslave people. Also very interesting to me is he was very pro copyright and pro rights of the artist.
Yeah.
But that when you die, it goes to the public domain. It goes to the people. Because he saw it as like, you write the thing, but someone reading it also helps create through their imagination. And once one of you dies, the rights would go fully to the other person. So I, the author, die, it goes to the public. Which is like really forward thinking for things. Just putting it out there. That's my academic English brain getting peaked. As he reached age 80, he was given tributes across France, streets named after him, given like presents from the leaders of the country. When he died in 1885 of pneumonia, there was national mourning. He had a state funeral, and he was laid in a crypt alongside Alexander Dumas and Émile Zola.
Sure.
So L'Enquiry, the man who laughs, cast your mind back to a 67-year-old Hugo. He's still in exile, and he can come back anytime.
Right.
You know, he's just being a little stubborn about it. The novel has the subtitle By the Order of the King as well, which I think is important to note here. We are set in 17th century England, and we follow a young boy named Gwynplaine. As he rescues a young girl in a snowstorm, they seek shelter with the carnival vendor named Ursus and his pet wolf, Homo. It's a Latin pun on like the name of like a wolf.
Yeah, there's a Latin phrase that basically means man is a wolf to men. And so the word homo is man in Latin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but I'm a child, you see.
Right.
So Gwynplaine has a mouth that has been mutilated into a grin. And so he joins the carnival in the freak sideshow part. He grows up with Ursus and the young girl whose name is Dia. Dia happens to be blind, and so, of course, Dia and Gwynplaine fall in love. Meanwhile, there is a Duchess Josiana who is bored. And so her fiance, she's been engaged to this guy since birth. He's like, why don't you go see the like the big show, the big carnival, and like this new show they have featuring this guy named Gwynplaine. Like, you'll laugh, you'll cry, you'll love it. So she goes, and Josiana and Gwynplaine's eyes lock, and they become very interested in each other. Now, there's a member of the court who arranges for Josiana and Gwynplaine to meet. This court member wants to, like, humiliate Josiana. But before Gwynplaine can get there, he gets sent to the dungeon, where he happens to meet this man who's undergoing torture. This man recognizes Gwynplaine, and he says, "My name is Dr. Hardquanonne." More like hard to pronounce. Hardquanonne. And he identifies Gwynplaine as a child that the doctor arranged to be mutilated and kidnapped.
Yes.
You see, Gwynplaine is actually the son of a lord in the court. And when his father got chased out of court, the tyrannical King James II arranged for the lord's son, named Fermain, to disappear. So this doctor had Fermain taken by kidnappers who were known to mutilate children to sell them either into, sideshows or to have them beg on the streets. And these child kidnappers, traffickers, named Fermain Gwynplaine.
I want to stop for a moment here.
Okay.
Because it's important to note. So these child kidnapper, mutilator, seller people, Hugo calls them comprachicos, and they're Spanish, and they're this known group that molds children the way the Chinese mold trees, is how it's described in the book. So bonsai, but with people. For example, with Gwynplaine, the way his smile has been mutilated or whatever, is the idea is that they take you for a long time, and they might put your body in a certain position and just keep it like that for long enough that it just stays like that forever now. Hugo describes them as giving people bad spines so that they'll turn out as dwarfs and all kinds of stuff. Hugo presents this as entirely real, that this is a real group that really exists and does this thing, and they are not real. They are a made-up thing. There's no such thing. Hugo invented the word comprachicos. It does not exist outside this novel. But there were, at the time that he wrote it, urban legends about this, basically.
Sure.
So this is sort of the QAnon Pizzagate of its day, God. Basically, that Hugo's invoking to torture this kid.
Wow. Okay. I didn't know that. So anyways, 4-year-old Fermain is sold to these comprachicos and named Gwynplaine. When this doctor shares his story and it comes to light that the Lord's son, Fermain, is still alive, he actually ends up getting to claim inheritance. Josiana, meanwhile, doesn't know any of this. She conspires to get Gwynplaine out of the dungeon because she wants to seduce him. Just as she's about to, someone bursts in and is like, "It's Fermain. He actually is the one who you're supposed to be engaged to, Josiana." And she's like, "Oh, well, I'll marry him, but now I don't want to fuck him." And so
it's not exciting anymore.
Yeah, she rejects him as soon as they are actually the same class.
Right, as long as he's not taboo.
Mm-hmm.
You are actually this thing. Turns out you had secret parents is a very Victor Hugo plot
very
twist.
Very romantic.
Yeah.
Gothic romantic. So Gwynplaine joins the upper class, but he's disgusted at their privilege and hypocrisy, and he actually calls them out on it in a speech to the court, and it's Queen Anne's court. But he gets laughed out because he's delivering this scathing critique with this big smile.
Mm-hmm.
So he renounces his title and all of his inheritance and goes back to try to find Ursus and Dea, who have both been deported from England because they had a wolf here.
You can't have wolves in England. That's just not cool.
Apparently, as soon as Gwynplaine had vanished without a trace, Dea had become very ill because they were in love.
And this is what makes you ill in the 1600s.
Absolutely, nothing else. Once Gwynplaine returns, she is so incredibly happy that she dies from the strain of the emotion.
Oh.
Ursus faints at all of this because he's like, "You're back, she's dead, what the fuck?" And he faints. So Gwynplaine, seeing that the love of his life is dead and presuming that his mentor is dead, throws himself overboard into the sea as they cross the channel. The end.
This is such a Victor Hugo novel.
Yes, it is.
If you're not familiar, the ending of Notre Dame de Paris is also hecka depressing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So pretty clear here is the critique of the ruling class that is bored with privilege, but then weaponizes that privilege for their own amusement with no regard for people's lives. And one thing that I wanted to call out in Gwynplaine's speech to the court is he says that I embody humanity as its masters have made it because of this like grotesque smile that he's been forced to wear. So the novel came out in 1869. Contemporary reviews were like, this is good, but it's not Les Mis, it's not Notre Dame, but yeah, it's good. And it's only really after Hugo's passing that people have started going like, no, actually, I think this might be one of his best works. So all of the adaptations of The Man Who Laughs come in the 20th century.
Got it.
The first is a French silent film in 1909, which is lost, unfortunately. Then there was a 1921 German silent film called Das Grimsed Geschicht, starring Franz Hobling and directed by Julius Hutzka. There was a 1921 Broadway play titled Clair de Lune, and this starred John Barrymore as Gwynplaine and his sister Ethel as Queen Anne. Then we get this 1928 American film adaptation by Paul Leni. After this, there's a 1932 French film adaptation of the Clair de Lune play, directed by Henri de Montberger. There's a 1950 comic book adaptation of the 1928 film, a 1966 Italian-French co-production, which resituates the time period to be about the Borgias being awful people. And there are many others after this, but most recently are some musical adaptations.
Okay. I can totally see like people targeting this to be a musical when like Les Mis and Phantom of the Opera are hit musicals.
Totally. The thing is, though, is with the case of like Les Mis and even pieces from Notre Dame de Paris, people were so inspired by Hugo's works that they started putting music to those storylines and those characters in his lifetime.
Did you see that 2012 live action French version?
Yes, I didn't mention it because I was like, there's a lot of adaptations of this.
It very much strikes me as a like, so The Dark Knight was a big hit.
Yeah.
Adaptation.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we're getting to the trivia point.
Yes.
We've been kind of talking around it.
Yes. The other thing about like The Man Who Laughs and its adaptations in the 20th century is, as you say, like Notre Dame de Paris was starting to be adapted like while the book was being written practically. Like there were adaptations of Les Mis right away. And as we see with other novels like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde or Frankenstein or Dracula, the adaptations create this like lineage of plot changes basically, where things in Hugo's novel that are like maybe like a little much get like smoothed out over time, right? You know, the Disney Hunchback of Notre Dame owes a lot to the 1939 movie version of Hunchback of Notre Dame, which, you know, owes a lot to the 1923 version, which is inspired. So like each of these adaptations builds on the one before to kind of iron out some of the weirdness in the source material. Man Who Laughs doesn't have that lineage, so a lot of the weirdness remains. I always heard that the novel was not well received in England, primarily because the novel sort of makes it obvious that Victor Hugo doesn't know shit about England. All you need to do is look at like the character names. So Universal was looking at Man Who Laughs, but ultimately decided to go with Phantom of the Opera. The thing that sort of saved Phantom of the Opera at first was director Rupert Julian, who had been brought in to finish Joseph von Stroheim's Merry-Go-Round after that movie went over budget, and Julian came in and like clamped down and got it done under time and under budget. And they were like, oh, okay, cool. We'll give you Phantom then, because there was this big concern that Phantom was going to run over budget. So the thing is, Phantom was a nightmare. Had a huge troubled production, which, as Sarah mentioned earlier, you can learn more about in episode 14. It was an extremely expensive production. It ended up running over budget, costing $1.5 million, and it only made $2 million when it was originally released in 1925. That film was then re-released several times with various revisions made each time, different endings, different tones. We go into all of that in the episode, but present in all of these versions was Lon Chaney in his memorable makeup as Eric the Phantom, which was, a key element in the movie. Now, while Phantom of the Opera had been an expensive nightmare of a movie, it did make a big impact on audiences who, reacted in shock and horror to Chaney's appearance, the famous stories of people fainting in the theaters and whatnot. So because of that, it was decided to do like a third project, this time returning to The Man Who Laughs. So like, okay, we're going to do Man Who Laughs as the Phantom follow-up. However, in 1925, Chaney signed an exclusive contract with MGM to go appear in movies directed by Todd Browning, and so without Lon Chaney, it seemed that any hopes of producing The Man Who Laughs were sort of pointless. Like, you don't have the Man of 1,000 Faces, so what are you going to do?
Yeah.
What made the difference was that director Paul Leni's 1924 film Waxworks was released in the United States. Waxworks is a German expressionist anthology film written by Henrik Galeen, who wrote Nosferatu. The film starred Emil Jannings as Harun al-Rashid in an Arabian Nights segment, Conrad Veidt as Ivan the Terrible in an historical segment, and Werner Krauss as Jack the Ripper in a very short horror segment at the end. Like, the Harun al-Rashid bit is 40 minutes, the Ivan the Terrible bit is 40 minutes, the Jack the Ripper bit is 6 minutes.
6 minutes?
Yeah, so 6 minutes out of an 86-minute runtime does not a horror movie make. Waxworks is not a horror movie. But it is German expressionist. Now, Paul Leni was born in Stuttgart in the German Empire in 1885 to a Jewish family. He was an avant-garde painter, and he studied at the Berlin Academy of Fine Arts before becoming a theatrical set designer. From theater, he progressed to film in 1913 as a set designer and art director. He began directing his own films in 1917, of which Waxworks was the 10th. Now, Carl Laemmle was himself a German expat, and he was highly impressed with Waxworks and brought both Paul Leni and Conrad Veidt over to Hollywood to do work for Universal. Leni's first film for Universal was 1927's The Cat and the Canary. Although it is an old dark house movie in the mold of The Bat, The Cat and the Canary saw Leni bring the visual style of German Expressionism to the American proto-horror film, and we discussed this in episode 19. And this visual style would be the one that Universal would then use in its earliest true horror films, Dracula and Frankenstein and so on. Films that were so influential on the genre that for a decade or more, Universal's style basically just dictated what horror movies looked like. Conrad Veidt was born in Berlin in 1893. He had originally wished to be a surgeon, but he did not do well enough in school, and so instead he decided to become an actor, to the great disappointment of his father. At age 19, he began loitering outside Berlin theaters after performances, hoping to be mistaken for an actor. He eventually got acting lessons and successfully auditioned for Max Reinhardt's company in 1913, playing minor roles. Then World War I broke out. Veidt served on the Eastern Front in the Battle of Warsaw. He contracted jaundice and pneumonia, and after recovering in an army hospital, he was judged unfit for duty and sent back home. In 1916, Veidt began acting on stage again, slowly attracting positive critical buzz. He debuted on film in 1917, becoming extremely prolific, although many of his early films are lost or only partially extant. His notable German films of the silent era include Different from the Others in 1919, the first film to depict homosexuality sympathetically, Eerie Tales in 1919, which we covered in episode 4.
Oh my God, that's so long ago.
The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari in 1920, which we covered in episode 5. The Head of Janus in 1920, which is a lost film. The Hands of Orlac in 1924, covered in episode 12. Waxworks in 1924. And The Student of Prague in 1926, which we covered in episode 18. Arriving in Hollywood with his second wife, Anna Radke, and his daughter Viola, Veidt appeared in 2 American films in 1927 before working with Leni again on The Man Who Laughs. Now, this was another Super Jewel production. So The Man Who Laughs was given a budget of $1 million, less than Hunchback and Phantom cost, but still like a huge amount in those days.
Yes.
With Lon Chaney out of the picture, Universal needed a makeup man, so they hired former actor turned makeup artist Jack Pierce to create Gwynplaine's rictus grin. Conrad Veidt was fitted with a set of dentures that had metal hooks to pull back the corners of his mouth. So while these dentures were in, Veidt was actually unable to speak.
Good thing it's a silent film, I guess.
Exactly. Playing the good girl love interest in the movie would be Mary Philbin. She had been under contract with Universal since she was 19 years old in 1921. In 1923, she starred in Erich von Stroheim's Merry-Go-Round opposite Norman Carey, which would lead to her being cast in the lead role of Christine Daae in Phantom of the Opera. So The Man Who Laughs is, obviously the follow-up project, placing her in the similar role of Dia. The movie's bad girl, the Duchess Josiana, is played by Russian actress Olga Baklanova. She was always cagey about her age, so sources place her birth variously between 1883 and 1900, with a date of 1893 being supported by scholarship. She studied drama and theater and began acting on stage in 1912. She appeared in around 17 Russian films starting in 1914. In 1925, the Moscow Art Theater put on a worldwide tour, and when the company left New York, Baklanova just sort of stayed behind.
She missed the boat.
Right.
Purposefully.
With her blonde hair and statuesque looks, she was able to win herself roles in American silent films, often asking to be credited solely as Baklanova in imitation of fellow acclaimed Russian immigrant actress Alla Natsamova. The Man Who Laughs is one of Baklanova's best remembered films, though 1928's The Docks of New York was probably her most successful in contemporary times. Her Russian accent did not play well in the sound era, and her career declined, leading to her second most notable role as the villainous Cleopatra in Todd Browning's Freaks in 1932, which we covered in episode 29.
Mm-hmm.
So she gets turned into the duck lady at the end.
Yeah.
She continued to appear in film and on stage until her retirement in 1955, and she passed away in Switzerland in 1974. The Man Who Laughs was originally produced as a silent film, with intertitles and music, which would be, provided live at the theater. But on October 6th, 1927, The Jazz Singer was released, and sound film was the new buzz. So Universal post-converted The Man Who Laughs into a partial sound film using Western Electric's Movie Tone Movie on Film system. So the film was given sound effects and a musical score, but with dialogue still being provided by the intertitles.
Sure.
The musical score was built around a song called When Love Comes Stealing, which was composed by Erno Rappi with lyrics by Walter Hirsch and Lou Pollock. The single was not the success that Universal would have liked. The Man Who Laughs premiered on April 27th, 1928 in New York in its silent version, before receiving general release in the United States in the partial sound version on November 4th, 1928. The contemporary critical reaction was mixed, with critics finding issue with the film's gruesome subject matter and with the Germanic production design, which was heavily expressionism flavored. In critics' minds, that sort of clashed with the 17th century England setting.
Sure. So when they saw Caligari, they just thought Germany looks like that?
Well, critics felt that it just wasn't very true to what England in the 17th century was like,
Okay.
which, to be fair, was also a criticism leveled at the novel. So modern critics, however, regard The Man Who Laughs as a late period expressionist classic, highly influential, and with particular praise given to Veidt's performance and Leni's direction. It's sometimes considered to be Leni's masterpiece. It received its first DVD release from Kino in 2003, and there was a 4K restoration released on Blu-ray in 2019 by Flicker Alley. The film has a long legacy. Jack Pierce would remain Universal's makeup man until a corporate shakeup in 1946, creating the original makeup designs for the classic Universal monsters. Charlie Hall's expressionist, gothic, mixed aesthetic for this film would also be iterated on in his work on the later Universal horror pictures. Possibly the most famous bit of trivia about this movie is that Conrad Veidt's appearance in this film inspired the creation of the Joker in Batman #1 in 1940 by Bill Finger, Bob Kane, and Jerry Robinson. All three of these men were major movie buffs, and the silent films of their youths provided a lot of inspiration in their comic book stories. Joker is not the only element of Batman that you can trace to an old movie that they ripped off.
Clayface and Lon Chaney.
Right. Or Batman in general and Zorro as popularized by Douglas Fairbanks.
Absolutely.
But definitely, like, when you look at how Joker was originally drawn in his first appearances, the way that Bob Kane and Jerry Robinson first drew him, it's very clear that it's Conrad Veidt as Gwynplaine, taking like very direct inspiration from his appearance in this film. But the character is totally different. As we've learned from Sarah's plot synopsis, like, Gwynplaine is a sympathetic hero, not anything... He
doesn't go around trying to pull pranks that kill you.
Right. Nothing like the Joker, who in his earliest appearances was very much a psychopath serial killer. So, you know, coming back to what I was saying at the start of the episode, like, this is part of, I think, the cycle of disappointment that people experience when they watch this movie, because they're expecting the character of Gwynplaine to be a villain or a monster in the vein of Quasimodo or Eric. Since the Quasimodo in Lon Chaney's version of Hunchback is slightly more in line with the novel's Quasimodo, who's very much a misanthrope. Anyways, because of this association, plays on the title The Man Who Laughs or the name Gwynplaine are very common in like modern Joker stories, because the writers are like, hee, I know that trivia. And you're like, yeah, I know that trivia too. Paul Leni's next film would be The Last Warning, a backstage mystery story that was meant to capitalize on the success of The Cat and the Canary. That film debuted on Christmas Day, 1928, but Leni would never direct a follow-up to The Man Who Laughs, as he died September 2nd, 1929, of sepsis from an untreated tooth infection, age 44.
Oh, I remember this. Oh, fuck. What a way to go, man. Fuck me. Teeth stuff really freaked me out, man. I don't know.
The follow-up to The Man Who Laughs was made, however, with 1929's The Last Performance, directed by Paul Fejos. Made in both a silent and sound version simultaneously, only the silent version has survived, and this dark drama stars Veidt as a sinister stage magician who's in love with a younger woman played by Mary Philbin. Very much kind of a like Svengali and Trilby kind of vibe. That movie received a mixed reception, and after dubbing her own voice in the partial sound re-release of Phantom of the Opera, Philbin retired from acting and became something of a recluse. She basically didn't leave her house until she was invited to the premiere of Andrew Lloyd Webber's Phantom of the Opera musical in the late 80s, and then she passed away at age 90 in 1993. Veidt's difficulties with English at this time led him to abandon Hollywood in the sound era and return to Germany. However, his stay was short-lived. His marriage to his third wife, Ilona Prager, became problematic when the Nazis took power due to his wife's Jewish heritage. Veidt despised Nazis, and so the two escaped to Britain, where Veidt finally learned English and began appearing in British films, like The Thief of Baghdad, where he plays like the Grand Vizier, like Jafar. In 1941, he returned to Hollywood after donating his life savings to the British war effort, going to Hollywood specifically to play Nazis in movies as like total bastards in order to sway public opinion in the US in favor of joining the war with Britain, which he did most memorably in his role as Major Strasser in Casablanca.
I really like Veidt, both as an actor and what I get from him as a person.
He had a inherited heart condition from his mother, and that led to his death of heart failure in 1943. So, yeah, that's the history of this movie. I'm really excited to watch it with you.
Same, yeah.
And right now, streaming options for it are pretty limited. It was on the Criterion Channel for a while as part of like a silent movie package that they had, but that isn't happening anymore. And so at the moment, I don't really know off the top of my head places where you can stream it other than it's available on a service called FlixFling.
That sounds a little, check your computer for viruses.
But ultimately, the movie is going to be in the public domain as of 2024.
Oh.
So, in a few more years, it'll be everywhere. But it's not in the public domain just yet.
Well, folks, hopefully you can find a copy to watch along with us. You're going to hear a brief musical interlude, and when we come back, we will discuss The Man Who Laughs from 1928, directed by Paul Leni.
See you on the other side, everybody. Welcome back to Scream Scene, everybody. We just finished watching The Man Who Laughs, directed by Paul Leni from 1928. Sarah, what did you think? It was your first time with this movie.
Yeah, I think I had to sit with this one for a little bit to really appreciate parts of it, because it follows a lot of the same plot beats as Hunchback. And at first I felt a little disappointed by Paul Leni because I'm like, when I think of Paul Leni, I think of the German expressionism that we saw in Cat and the Canary.
Right.
But as I kind of sat with this and started thinking about things, I realized like, now he's still doing the things. It's just in a different and arguably more subtle way. Because this isn't horror.
Yeah.
So why would he use the same visual stylings as he does in a horror movie in a not horror movie? You know? So I like that I had the chance to kind of sit with it to really start to appreciate that part.
Yeah, there's some very striking visuals
Yes.
in this movie, for sure.
What about you? This is like, I presume like your third or fourth time seeing this?
Probably third.
Okay.
Yeah. Mostly I was really surprised by how well I remembered Gwynplaine's theme from the score. I was like, oh yeah, I know this music. So yeah, that was neat. And then like, I didn't really remember how this movie ended.
Sure.
So I was like, okay, cool. So yeah, it was a good time.
Cool. Well, let me give the plot synopsis for our listeners. By and large, it appears to follow the novel's plot pretty closely. There are some minor changes, though. So we go in like chronological order of events rather than the novel's flashback halfway through situation.
Yeah, you lose that kind of Victor Hugo, like, surprise, your dad was a nobleman kind of like thing.
Yeah. We open with King James and his jester, Barkilphedro.
Definitely a real English name.
Absolutely. Mocking a Lord Clancharlie. Also a very real English name.
It sounds like it's trying to maybe be like a Scots.
Because clan is in there.
Clancharlie.
But like it's no,
It's,
that's
yeah,
not how
no.
things work.
No.
Anyways, Lord Clancharlie is put into the Iron Maiden after being mocked that his son was given to Compachicos, and specifically a Compachico surgeon. Next, we cut to a decree that all Compachicos are exiled out of England. GTFO, even though you did me that favor, says King James.
Yeah. No one will ever know.
But we see that Gwynplaine as a child is left behind. And we are on the, like, snowy cliffs of the frozen Dover.
It's Cornwall. They're in Cornwall, but yes.
A frozen Cornwall.
Yes, it's like the fucking Arctic up in here.
So Gwynplaine, the young child, wanders the frozen wasteland. He ends up finding baby Dia, and they take refuge with Ursus and his pet wolf Homo. As adults, we see that Gwynplaine and Dia are in love, and they have a traveling show where Gwynplaine is known as the man who laughs. That's the name of the movie. And he's like a famous clown. And, you know, Dia is like, hey, when we get married, would love to be married to you. And Gwynplaine's like, but you're blind, so you don't know what you're signing up for because you can't see how horribly ugly I am. And he actually refuses to even let her touch his face. As they are doing one of those shows, we see that the Compachico surgeon that we know as Dr. Hardquanonne.
Yeah. A definitely real name.
Yes. recognizes Gwynplaine and then tries to use the fact that Gwynplaine's still around and in England as a means to blackmail a Duchess Josiana. The reason why he chooses to blackmail Josiana is because she is enjoying the wealth and privilege of the Clancharlie estate, even though she has no real claim to it. However, his letter is intercepted by our old friend Barkilphedro, who's still around, no longer a jester. Now he's a respectable crony, and he takes the letter to Queen Anne. Now, Josiana is engaged to a Lord Deary Moore.
Also a definitely real name.
Here in England as well. And to kind of summarize their personalities and relationship, she's a slut and he's an idiot.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And Josiana, because she doesn't show a lot of respect to the queen, has gotten on her bad side.
To use like 1920s parlance, she's a vamp.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So Josiana is at the fair and sees Gwynplaine's performance. And while everyone in the audience laughs and mocks him, she, doesn't laugh and just stares. And this catches Gwynplaine's eye when he is on stage. So that night, Gwynplaine receives a letter saying hey, it's the sexy lady who didn't laugh. Come meet me at night. Mm. And Gwynplaine's like, fuck yeah, because if a woman who can see my ugliness can love me, then maybe I can deserve to marry Dia. That's
some definite logic you have there, Gwynplaine.
So he goes to Josiana's rooms.
Her boudoir.
Her boudoir. And the seduction is interrupted by a letter that Josiana receives from the queen herself. You see, because Josiana had gotten on Queen Anne's bad side, and she knew, and Anne knew that Gwynplaine has a claim to these estates, she's like, well, perfect. I'm going to make Josiana have to marry Gwynplaine, the clown, in order to keep her estates. Josiana reads this and starts, crying and is, really upset. Gwynplaine doesn't see what's in the letter. He just thinks it's because he's ugly. So he leaves and is very upset. Basically, this whole interaction confirming his fear that he's just too ugly for anyone to want to be around. Except when he gets back, he sees that Dia has found the letter, knows that he's out with another lady because she smelled the perfume or something, and was very upset and finally, when Gwynplaine comes back, she's so relieved. And she's like, I'm so happy you're back because, like, you know, I love you. And he's like, yeah, but I'm ugly. And she's like, well, God made me sightless so I could only see the real Gwynplaine. And he's like, that makes sense. Let's get married. Except this is a melodrama, so there's a lot of excepts. Mm-hmm. But wait, the Queen's guards come in to arrest Gwynplaine. And he's taken to prison. Now, Ursus follows and basically believes that Gwynplaine has been killed. It doesn't help that later Barkilphedro later tells Ursus that, yeah, no, he's dead. Except that we see that Gwynplaine is actually being prepped for lordship. Ursus at first is like, well, I can't tell Dia that Gwynplaine is dead. So the show must go on. We'll pretend that there's still a show and Gwynplaine's still here because Dia is blind and can't tell the difference. Except she can tell the difference. And then, of course, the guards burst in again to say, you guys are getting exiled out of England. Get out. Conveniently at the same time that Gwynplaine is being introduced to the House of Lords. Now, when Gwynplaine is introduced to the House of Lords, the Queen is like, and this is the latest Lord. And also he's going to marry Josiana. And that is what I am decreeing. And ultimately, like, everyone keeps laughing at Gwynplaine because his face. And he finally just gets so fed up and he confronts the Lord saying, like, you guys are assholes. I'm not going to follow the Queen's orders. Like, they start calling him a clown for disobeying the Queen. And he's like, well, before I was a clown and before I was a lord, I was a man. God damn it. And he tries to escape. And then we get a fun escape over rooftops chase scene, complete with some sword fights. Finally, he makes it to the docks to where Ursus and Dia are. Now we do see that Barkilphedro has followed in a carriage and is trying to catch up to Gwynplaine. Now Homo the wolf, I forget how, he smells on the wind that Barkilphedro is nearby and swims to shore and rips his fucking throat out.
Yeah, he like pounces on him and like his jaws just like wrap around Barkilphedro's throat and then like pulls him into the water.
Rip to Barkilphedro.
Right.
We see that Gwynplaine sees where the boat is. He jumps into the channel, swims, and they can all be reunited because it's a happy ending. He's on the boat. No one dies from the like passion of seeing that he's there and not dead. Like everything's fine, and they sail off away from England. And Homo gets back on the boat too. He doesn't get left behind. The end.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, while it's pretty typical for Hollywood to give a happy ending when they do like a literary adaptation of a book where everyone dies.
Yeah.
I will say that in this case, I think it is for the best.
Yeah.
I understand that like tragic endings were kind of like the trend du jour in like Victor Hugo's era.
Yeah.
Because they were more romantic. But when you're following these characters for 2 hours, to just have them all kind of die at the end really sucks. It makes you go like, why did I watch this movie? In the book, you know, you read this book so that Victor Hugo could like tell you some political stuff. But in terms of the movie, if they all died at the end, you'd be like, okay, then what was the point of all this? And furthermore, as you kind of said, Sarah, they all die for really stupid reasons, right? Like
it's almost like a Romeo and Juliet kind of ending. Or not even. It's like that story where like she cuts off her hair to buy him a chain for his like watch, and he sells his watch to buy her a comb. And it's like, if you guys just talk to each other, it would have been fine.
Except that like, you know, it's the kind of thing where how does the book ends like he gets on the boat,
Dia dies from like the like, oh my god, you're alive. Blah.
Yeah,
die.
Which is like a stupid, like that's stupid. And I'm sorry, but like any modern audience is just like not gonna buy that. This idea that like the Romantics had that people would just keel over dead from like strong emotions, especially if it's like a happy emotion. Like for whatever reason, we still kind of have like, I died of sadness as like a thing in stories sometimes, no matter how dumb it is. But like, I died because I was so happy you were here is really dumb. And then for Gwynplaine to just be like, oh, Dia's dead, I guess I'll kill myself. Like, it's just, okay, were you guys all idiots this whole time? Why was I? So I like the happy ending better.
Yeah, I wasn't surprised that was a change made in this Hollywood movie. I was a little surprised by the Errol Flynn-esque chase scene at the end, because Conrad Veidt is like jumping over rooftops and doing his own stunts.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't know how old you are, but I worry about you, Conrad.
Let's see. He was born in 1903, I thought I said in the context setting. Yeah, let me double check my own context setting notes.
He's 35, Ben. He's 35.
Yeah, and
I'm not even 35, and I can't even imagine jumping off of rooftops.
Yeah, they've got him doing his own stunts like he's Douglas Fairbanks, and I just think it's kind of funny because it's like, welcome to Hollywood, Conrad.
He's like, fuck this, back to Germany.
Yeah.
I just need to stare at my hands.
I think what we're seeing here with the like chase action ending is Universal learning their lesson from Phantom of the Opera, where like at first they filmed the book's ending where Christine kisses the Phantom and he's overwhelmed by emotion and dies and then lets them go. Then they were like, okay, that doesn't work. So they filmed the second ending, which was for the comedy version. And I don't remember what that ending was. And then finally they did the third ending, which was like a big, angry mob with torches and pitchforks chasing after the Phantom through the streets of Paris until he gets mobbed to death. And so I think like having gone through that experience, they were probably like, yeah, let's just do the chase mob, someone drowns in the river ending from the get-go. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the other thing too. When, we have the mob chasing them, I was like, but who's going to get Barkilphedro? Because he's been like the main villain.
Yeah.
There's no way he is surviving. And so when Homo jumped into the water, I was like, oh yeah.
Yeah, that the main villain gets killed because like the dog goes for him is wild.
I guess that's why his name is Barkilphedro.
Haha.
What a laugh.
So there's a couple like really silly things about this movie. I don't really understand what Gwynplaine's act is supposed to be, because it's clear that like the novelty of it is like, oh hey, he can't stop smiling, so we're gonna laugh at that. But like the actual performance, they have some clowns who intro the show, which is a play written by Ursus,
a philosopher, which he says is like Shakespeare but better. We don't get any like dialogue from this play. All we really see is that there's some people in monster costumes going at it. And then fighting.
Yes. And then Dia shows up as if she's some sort of like angelic figure. Gwynplaine comes on, and for the show, he has like clown makeup on over his face, and he gets out there and he has clearly some dialogue, and people laugh at him and he laughs. And then that's like the end of the show, I guess. It's very odd to me.
I'm sure it's something along the lines of like, because the beasts get turned into Gwynplaine, and so he has something like, the beasts are inside me or something. I'm just putting two and two together. I don't really know anything.
It's a little strange.
It is a little strange, yes.
The other thing is, it's not that I don't understand the premise of the story.
It's that he has a mutilated face but still finds love.
Right, exactly. And I get that he's supposed to be like a monster on the level of Quasimodo or Eric. But the thing is, like, okay, so the makeup effects for Gwynplaine are real good.
Yes.
Because you can tell it's not just Conrad Veidt having to hold a smile all the time. You can tell that it's a forced smile created by Jack Pierce's makeup, because like his eyes and brow are doing all this emoting, and the whole thing that makes Gwynplaine disturbing is that like mismatch, right? That he can be like sad or angry or disturbed and he's still grinning, right?
Yeah, I think Conrad Veidt was the perfect casting for this, because the acting he does with his eyes and his brow and forehead is very similar and reminiscent of the acting we see in 1924's Hands of Orlac, of just being so like distraught over his hands. Only this, like, I don't know, this feels like there's an extra layer of depth more than just like, are my hands a murder's hands? But that pain of like, they keep laughing at me and I'm so upset about this. And it's really interesting when like you see him smiling and he has like tears in his eyes, and it does look like he's crying a bit because he's laughing so hard. And then he brings up his hand to cover his mouth, and it's like, oh no, he's really upset actually.
Yeah.
Just like a really well done illusion of that.
Yeah. The movie doesn't really go into the like sideshow performer's paradox of like, I hate that everyone laughs at me because of my deformity, but also like,
what else am I going to do?
Right. Like here I am on stage performing in a performance that is, hey, come laugh at me because of my deformity. It's a little weird to me that like this, like that Ursus is the one who like creates this show and puts it on because he's the one who like found them as kids and raised them. Because like, so then you know how much this upsets him. And you were like, let's make money off it. That's a little weird to me. But also, everyone, including Gwynplaine, acts as if his eternal smile means that, like, he's ugly or he's hideous. And, like, people look at him with, like, shock. And he's not?
That's the downside of casting Conrad Veidt.
You're right. He's very, very attractive.
Yeah.
But also, like, he's smiling. And there's like an ironic thing there, and Victor Hugo is doing like a weird political commentary thing about like the richest people force smiles on the lower class or whatever. But it's not really like the horror of it is the, you know, weird emotional disconnect when he's expressing himself. But it's not exactly like, oh, I could never marry a man so hideous because he only smiles all the time. It's like, most people are actually like really nice to look at when they're smiling. I don't know. It's just like a bit of a disconnect in the premise for me.
Fair. I think they do a pretty good job of making the smile scary.
Yeah.
Like, because it is just so extreme, the way it's showing the teeth. They did a really good job of making it more than just like a smile and a forced smile. Yeah,
for sure. Like it's pulled back pretty extreme, so you're always seeing like his mouth, and the dentures that he wears give his like top row of teeth this very like they're like a size too big maybe or something.
Yeah, like long and almost like silvery glisteny.
And the gums are always prominent. Like you can always see the top layer of gums above his top layer of teeth.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's like a good freaky look. I can see why later versions of adaptations of this have tried to go with like the 2012 adaptation of this went with like a Chelsea grin look for Gwynplaine.
Okay.
Which if you don't know, that's where you like cut someone basically from like ear to ear and like intersected with their mouth. So you basically, if they like open their mouth wide, it's bad, but it's Heath Ledger in The Dark Knight, if you don't know what it is. And that's what they did for the 2012 movie. And it does give him like a more grotesque appearance, but it's also like, that's not the same thing. That's not a permanent grin. That's scars caused by like cuts that like make it look like he's smiling in a kind of weird, grotesque way. But it's not the same thing as only being able to smile all the time. And it's not the same thing as what's in the book.
As we're saying, like Veidt does a really good job here. Mary Philbin is fine.
Yeah.
A little one note, but there's not really any other note for Dia to play.
Yeah, she's doing a good job at what she's supposed to do. It's just that mostly that means to stare blankly into space and look pure and innocent.
The actor who played Ursus was really good. I really liked his performance. You really feel like he has really taken on that fatherly role. He feels very protective of these people while also being like, no, really, get married, please.
And also like how distraught he is when things go wrong.
Yeah. So I really liked his performance. And then I think the other person to mention here is Baklanova as Josiana.
Yeah, so
She is having so much fun, borderline eating scenery.
I think what you can say about everyone in the cast of this movie is that they understood the assignment,
Yes.
as it were. Baklanova, I don't know if it's Paul Leni, if it's the costume designer, or if it's Baklanova herself, but like Josiana's breasts are like threatening to pop out at any moment all the time.
A couple of times, it's Baklanova herself who like pulls her shirt open practically.
Yeah.
But yes.
There's a whole scene where she takes like a bath in like a big like rich person pool, and this like servant is like looking through the keyhole, and we get like a lot of side boob, you know,
A lot of butt.
Yeah, like
but definitely pre-code.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know how accurate to the period the costumes are in this movie. They look okay, especially like the Lord's costumes and the Queen's costumes and stuff. I don't really know how accurate like what Gwynplaine's wearing normally is or anything. What I do know is that when Gwynplaine goes to Josiana's boudoir and she's wearing a black silk lace nightie, that is not accurate to the 1690s.
I really, the way that she wears it, it really feels like Baklanova showed up to set on that day and was like, no, let's have me wear this. I think it's really going to sell it more.
I brought this from home.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the sound. Because this is like a partial sound film. It has sound effects, and there's points when people are like cheering for Gwynplaine, and you hear people yelling like, yay, Gwynplaine. And it was just like neat, because when you said sound effects, I figured, okay, we'll hear people cheering. But to hear it so specific to the movie, I don't know. I thought it was really neat, and I enjoyed the experience.
The other thing is the sound effects aren't consistent. It's not like if you were watching a modern movie and I just said, oh yeah, there's the dialogue's silent, but everything else is the same. Like sometimes a carriage going by makes noise, or sometimes like a door closing makes a noise, but not every time, which really makes it have a very interesting kind of feel to watch.
It's very selective in what it wants you to pay attention to.
And that might be like a technological limitation of how many tracks they can put or something, but it is noticeable in scenes like where they're cheering for him, but you don't hear anything other than the cheering, right? What did you think? So my favorite piece of music in the score is Gwynplaine's theme, but there's also this like love theme that at 2 points in the movie becomes the song When Love Comes Stealing.
It is jarring and takes me out of the movie both times. When it first shows up, it's when when Gwynplaine returns and he's like, yeah, okay, Dia, let's get married. I think it's so jarring because we haven't heard dialogue.
Yeah, it's the first human voice you've kind of heard the whole movie.
Yeah, besides the cheers or whatever. And it's also just like jarring in its style. It does not feel like it fits at all.
Yeah, it's a very 1920s ballad kind of song.
Warbly.
Yeah, very warbly, like operatic range, but singing a ballad kind of sound to it, which is very contemporary to the 1920s. So it's kind of like, you know, if you were watching like a version of The Three Musketeers that just sort of like had like a dubstep track in the middle of it.
It's weird.
Like a Bieber song.
And then it shows up again at the end.
Yeah.
And I'm more forgiving of it at the end because it's like, yeah, it's the end. Like, roll the end credits scene, you know?
Yeah, that's where you put your single that you want to get an Oscar for Best Original Song for, is you put it over the credits at the end.
Yeah, so it just... I feel like that's definitely a place where this film has a misstep. But, I mean, I understand why it's here.
I think that the movie could have used, like, some tighter editing. It kind of drags its feet getting going. So, like, because we don't have the flashback structure, we have, Clan Charlie getting tortured. We have Gwynplaine being abandoned. We have Gwynplaine being found by Ursus. We now have him as an adult. We go to the carnival. We set up that he has like this show. But then we go to like Dr. Hardquanonne, who, by the way, did you mention what happened to Hardquanonne?
Oh, the blackmail goes terribly. He just gets killed.
Yeah, because that's like, don't blackmail people who have their own private guards and shit.
To be fair, I can understand him going after the Duchess. It's not his fault that it gets intercepted by the Queen.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, not surprised what happens to Hardquanonne. I will say, the way it happens in the movie is it's implied that Hardquanonne goes to blackmail the Duchess because he's jealous of Gwynplaine's act being so much more popular than his 5-legged cow.
Yes, because that's, the whole reason they reconnect is they're both at the same fair. Yeah, that is absolutely how it plays.
Which is so funny. It's like, yeah, you got killed over being jealous that no one wanted to see your 5-legged cow.
Yeah, it's so petty. So anyway, so we have the fair. And it's like, oh, Gwynplaine has a show. He's going to put on a show. And we're like, cool. Let's see the show. And they're kind of doing this weird thing where it's clear that they kind of didn't want to really show you the full effect of his smile until he's on stage. But they can't like really get away with not showing it to you at all. So you're kind of seeing bits and pieces of it. And we're like, oh, she's going to see the show. And this is where we'll see the show. But instead, like, Dirry-Moir meets her there and is like, hey, what are you doing, like, sledding it about down here? And she's like, what are you doing sledding it about down here? And they leave and go to court, and there's a bunch more scenes at court, and then she comes back to the fair for a second time, and that's when we see the show. So the beginning feels really drawn out. It feels like we're halfway through the movie before we see, like, Gwynplaine's show. But then in the second half, it's like, yeah, and then we arrested him. We take him to the prison. Next thing you know, he's in a carriage wearing like a full Lord's getup going to the House of Lords. And then he's in the House of Lords. They laugh at him. They do keep Gwynplaine's like speech at the House of Lords, but because it's a silent movie and they're running out of time, they do simplify Hugo's political point like immensely, whereas Hugo was trying to make some point about how like the nobles are corrupt and they keep the little person down and like force smiles on them so they don't think of their troubles or whatever. This movie just goes for a very simple like
humanistic, I'm still a man.
Yeah, all men are created equal kind of thing, which is a much more like generic kind of message. And then it's like we have a chase and a fight scene, right? And then it's over. So it feels to me like this maybe could have picked up the pace a bit more near the start.
I agree with you that it could have picked up the pace, but I disagree that the beginning needed it. I liked seeing the world from Gwynplaine as a child's view. That's when we get most of the horror stuff of like skeletons hanging on the wind. And I think that's where you really see a lot of the stylistic similarities between this movie and Cat and the Canary.
There's some really striking shots in that opening part.
Yeah. But then once he's an adult, it feels like it kind of lags. And it especially lags when Josiana shows up. Because the movie's like, okay, we're going to show some TNA. And then drag out her seeing the show so we can have her doing random antics.
Yeah, she really should have just gone to the fair the one time.
Yeah, but I guess, you have to set up that... You don't really need to set up that the Queen's upset with her.
You already kind of know that. You can get that across in other ways. Yeah, so the middle of it drags.
And the whole part of like, oh, well, let's still put on the show so Dia doesn't know that Gwynplaine's dead was like really uncomfortable.
Oh, yeah. Especially because it's like, no one's gonna buy. Well, not only even if she bought this, which she's not going to, you can't just keep this up forever.
Like, what the fuck? No, just tell her, don't treat disabled people like children. They are able to comprehend thoughts and grief.
Right,
Ursus. Like I appreciate Ursus as a father figure, but man. Come on.
It kind of, to me, feels like Ursus has his own little, like, psychic break there.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. As he's cheering, like, being like, yeah, Gwynplaine, come on stage. He absolutely has a break. Yeah, I think definitely could have used some editing help. I kind of want to speak to Paul Leni's style here.
For sure.
So like I said at the top of this second half, I felt a little let down at first. And as I started to think on it, I think Paul Leni uses his visual styling to emphasize the class differences rather than the German expressionism horror stuff and like psychological perspective of things that you see in like Cat and the Canary. There are still like German expressionism elements here, but they're not as emphasized. The way that he uses visuals to tell the class story is, I think, easiest to compare with Josiana's room with like this big bath, a fucking monkey, like full of like decadence.
Right.
Compared to how like the streets are shown, or even just the like carriage that Gwynplaine, Dia, and Ursus live in, where there's like no little trinkets everywhere. It's very stark and minimal.
Sure. The streets have a very like expressionist aesthetic to them in a way, especially like at night.
It's because they're so tall and pointed. But to me, like, I almost don't even read that as German expressionism anymore, because you see that in like Frankenstein, for example. To be fair, Frankenstein takes a lot of German expressionism, but it's not as like trademark German expressionism as you see in Caligari, where like, yes, they're tall and spindly, but they're also curved and, you know, the Tim Burton look to everything.
Well, the guy who did the set designs for this went on to do Frankenstein, right?
Oh, okay.
And
well,
like all the later Universal horror movies.
Yeah.
And so I think what you can see here is, if you want to see like the evolution of that visual style from Caligari to Frankenstein, you can kind of go like Caligari, Hands of Orlac, this, Frankenstein, and you can see that visual evolution.
Absolutely. There are some neat shots and compositions, some neat movements, but nothing that's like, oh, I've never seen this before. It's just like, oh, yeah, this is neat. I'm glad Leni got a chance to do this.
Yeah, he has some cool stuff that shows throughout that he's still thinking of like his camera as a moving camera and things like that. And he's paying attention to the visuals more than maybe like an American director of the same period. I really think that this is overall very good for what it is, which is a period melodrama.
Oh, absolutely. Underline melodrama several times, because the amount of times that in the plot synopsis I'm like, except.
Right.
But then, yes, melodrama because of that structure, but also the way that each character is playing a little bit of that trope. Good girl, bad girl, misunderstood hero or protagonist, whatever.
Yeah. It's
dastardly villain.
Right. It's definitely not horror.
Yes.
Yeah. And the idea that like Gwynplaine is a horror character is facetious, I say.
And I like that the horrific visuals that we get at the beginning, with seeing Clancharlie pushed into the Iron Maiden, the skeletons hanging on the chilly wind. I really like that because, especially with the skeletons, we're currently seeing the world from the point of view of a like traumatized child. So of course it looks horrific. But then as he grows up, he has a loving family. Like, then we're into the romantic melodrama.
Right.
Because he's kind of overcome some of that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely a big showcase for Conrad Veidt.
Absolutely. I keep saying absolutely, but it's like, yep, I agree.
Well, this was really fun to watch with you, Sarah. I'm glad that you finally got to see it.
Yeah, it's been on my to-watch list for a long time. Thank you, Creatures of the Night, for listening, and thank you, Patrons of the Night, for voting on this film for the horror-adjacent episode this month.
If you'd like to join our Patreon, you can do so at patreon.com/screamscenepodcast. You can sign up for as little as $1 a month, but patrons at the $5 and $10 level get access to regular bonus content. So that's patreon.com/screamscenepodcast.
We will, of course, have a poll up to decide the next horror-adjacent bonus episode, and patrons at any level can vote on that. The next Scream Scene episode will be out on Wednesday as regularly scheduled.
See you then, Creatures of the Night.
Bye!
Bye!